Our first speaker of this final panel is Ovidiu Stanciu, and his talk is titled Kojève's Double Dualism. And Ovidiu is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the Universidad Diego Portales in Santiago de Chile, and also a research associate at the Husserl Archives in Paris. He is a former student of the École Normale Supérieure in Paris and holds an MA in Contemporary Philosophy from the Sorbonne, and a PhD in philosophy from Université de Bourgogne and the Bergische Universität Wuppertal. And his thesis was on the problem of metaphysics in Heidegger and Patočka. Ovidiu was previously university lecturer in philosophy at the Institut d'études politiques, Sciences Po, and at the Institut Catholique de Paris. He has published a paper on the dialogue between Kojève and Traducteur, which is called Le lieu de la négativité. And he has also, what is worth mentioning, translated Kojève's introduction to Hegel into Romanian. So I hand over to you, Ovidiu.
Well, thank you very much, Isabel. My thanks also to all the organizers for hosting this wonderful event, and to all of you for the very stimulating discussions that have been going on so far. Without further ado, I start my paper. The guiding ambition of Kojève's philosophical project, underlying both his lecture at the École Pratique and his later writings, is that of performing a repetition of Hegel's philosophy. This characterization refers not only to the external aspect of his discourse, to the fact that it often takes on the form of a commentary or paraphrase of Hegel's writings, but captures the inmost core of his theoretical commitment. Indeed, Kojève does not attempt to add a missing piece to the Hegelian system of knowledge or to integrate it into a larger framework, nor is he seeking to extract a dimension Hegel left unthought and to use it as a springboard for the development of an original position. His purpose is only to stage a vast anamnesis of the Hegelian discourse, or, to use his own formula, to restate all that Hegel had already said, redire tout ce que Hegel a déjà dit. Kojève's endeavor appears thus to have the paradoxical aspect of a massive and obstinate effort, ultimately aiming at its own self-dissolution. The ambition of his discourse is not to break new philosophical ground, but rather to devise the adequate setting where the compelling force and the enduring relevance of Hegel's work might shine again. This radical fidelity is above all sustained by his conviction that Hegel has brought to fulfillment the fundamental possibilities opened up by the Greek inception of philosophy, so that no step forward beyond Hegel is conceivable. In the preface to Concept Time Discourse, Kojève gives a sharp and lapidary formulation to this idea. I quote him: "One will therefore find nothing new in the pages that follow. One will even find an attempt, comforting for my self-esteem as an author, to show that it is materially impossible to say something else and more than what Hegel has already said." End of quote. Yet, as has often been noted, Kojève's project of repeating Hegel is by no means tantamount to a form of philosophical impersonation, to a theoretical mimetism or ventriloquism. Insofar as it is intended and programmatic, the repetition is carried out from the distance separating the initial affirmation from its reiteration, the Hegelian project from its Kojèvian reenactment. Hence, an accurate rendering of his approach hinges on the answer given to the following questions. What are the most consequential events that took place on the philosophical scene between Hegel and Kojève? What occupies the interval between the philosopher and his commentator? Now, if we pay heed to the few texts where Kojève tackles this question straightforwardly, we can affirm that, on his account, one substantial and path-breaking philosophical event occurred between 1831 and 1933. I quote him: Heidegger was able to say things, if not absolutely new, at least such as to make it possible to take a step forward on the path of philosophical progress, which seemed to be definitively blocked by Hegel, end of quote. Therefore, Kojève's distinctive way of repeating Hegel bears the imprint of Heidegger's philosophy, and it is precisely this specific angle that can account for the discrepancy between his position and the more canonical interpretations of Hegel. We could thus claim that Kojève's approach consists in a reinstantiation of Hegel's philosophy after the Heideggerian moment, or that Kojève's Hegel is, to use Jean Val's apt characterization, a post-Heideggerian Hegel, an expression post-Heideggerian Hegel, which I take to be essentially different from the most common and often misleading claim of a Heideggerianized interpretation of Hegel. Now, the momentous impact of Heidegger's work for the formation of Kojève's philosophical program is beyond doubt and has been acknowledged ever since the publication of the introduction in 1947. However, the precise outlines and the exact implications of Heidegger's influence deserve closer scrutiny. In what follows, I will claim that the reference to Heidegger operates at four distinct levels of analysis. In the first place, Kojève stresses the propedeutic significance of Heidegger's work for a proper understanding of Hegel's project, and claims that Heidegger functioned for him as an indispensable hermeneutical guide for approaching the otherwise abstruse Hegelian system. As he puts it in the essay d'Histoire raisonnée de la philosophie païenne, it was Heidegger who, in fact, introduced me to the Hegelian system of knowledge, which I would not have been able to access without him. And the same claim is reiterated in the introduction in le concept, le temps, le discours. However, while Zeinon's site provides a valuable key to an adequate understanding of Hegel's enterprise, this relationship functions also the other way around. Kojève insists that the philosophical innovations brought about by Heidegger can be grasped in all their magnitude only when placed against the backdrop of Hegel's philosophy. In a review published in 1936 in Recherche philosophique, he writes that, I quote, "The Heideggerian ideas that are usually accounted for by the influence of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Bergson, etc., are all to be found in Hegel, notably in his phenomenology and in his previous writings. It is therefore only by confronting them with Hegel's work that we can understand and appreciate the philosophical scope of Heidegger's work and discover what is truly new in it." End of quote. Thus, Kojève sets up a double operation consisting in making Heidegger the indispensable mediator for an understanding of Hegel's thought, and on the other hand, making Hegel the true philosophical ancestor of Heidegger. Secondly, Kojève contends that Hegel's phenomenology and modern phenomenology, that is Husserlian and Heideggerian phenomenology, adopt the same methodological stance. Both determine thought as a passive instance which embraces the appearing without inserting it into a previously constituted subjective framework. In his first lectures at École Pratique, Kojève insists that Hegel's approach must be understood as phenomenological in the modern sense of the term. And he explicitly refers to Heidegger saying that Hegel's phenomenology is existential like Heidegger's. Displaying the methodological affinity between Hegel and modern phenomenology allows Kojève to make a larger interpretative point, namely that Hegel's method should be understood as descriptive and not as dialectical. The dialectic translates the inner movement of the real and not unfolding of the process of thinking. Thirdly, Kojève argues that Hegel's and Heidegger's anthropologies share a basic philosophical commitment, namely their attachment to finitude. Both endeavor to determine subjectivity as finite, mortal, and human. The kinship thus established between Hegel and Heidegger allows Kojève to dismiss the infinitist or theological readings of Hegel as ill-founded. Finally, Kojève considers Heidegger to be an indispensable ally in his attempt to uncover and overcome the limitations of Hegel's ontology. On Kojève's account, the insufficiency of Hegel's position derives from his allegiance to the principles of pagan ontology, that is, to ontological monism. The adoption of such a stance makes it impossible to draw the appropriate distinction between the mode of being of subjectivity and the mode of being of the natural thing. The most prominent testimony of this homogeneous ontology is Hegel's attempt of construing a dialectical philosophy of nature. The dialectical categories, well suited for the description of the historical realm, are uncritically projected onto nature, which leads to the absurdities, claims Kojève, of a Schelling-inspired naturphilosophy. Drawing on Heidegger's account of the ontological difference, Kojève seeks to enforce a radical divide between the human and the thingish reality, between subject and substance, history and nature. Heidegger appears thus to be the chief proponent of a dualistic ontology, whose elaboration Kojève considers to be, as he writes in a decisive footnote of the introduction, the main philosophical task of the future, end of quote. To sum up, Heidegger's bearing on Kojève's reading of Hegel is manifest in 4 different contexts. Heidegger is an indispensable hermeneutical guide, providing a comprehensive access to Hegel's system. He furthermore allows to make visible the descriptive character of Hegel's method and the finite scope of Hegel's anthropology. Lastly, but most importantly, Heidegger allows Kojève to overcome the shortcomings of Hegel's ontology, and insofar as Hegel's ontological monism is inconsistent with his own phenomenological dualism, to render Hegel's ontology coherent with his phenomenology. In what follows, I will focus on this last 2 aspects of Kojève's engagement with Heidegger, and I will refer more particularly to the preparatory notes for the review of Alfred Delp's book Tragische Existenz, published posthumously in 1993 under the title Notes on Hegel and Heidegger. The sweeping claim guiding these developments in these notes is that, I quote, Heidegger's anthropology is a kin apparenté to Hegel's anthropology. This kinship is manifest in their joint effort to extricate subjectivity from the paradigm of the res, of the worldly thing. Subjectivity would be misunderstood in its most specific dimension if it were conceived of as a province of the natural world. Furthermore, insofar as nature designates a realm of constant presence, which maintains itself identical with itself, withdrawing subjectivity out of nature entails grasping it as finite. Indeed, Kojève attributes to both Hegel and Heidegger the thesis that subjectivity and finitude are inextricably bound together. Thus, he writes that a self-consciousness that would not imply finitude would be inconceivable, or again, in a more lapidary way, cogito sum ergo sum finitus, end of quote. Finitude is therefore the principle of subjectivation. The transition from the natural being to subjectivity amounts to a process of finitization. And the phenomenon which most glaringly attests finitude is death. On this view, subjectivity is necessarily finite, that is, mortal. Here, however, a qualification is necessary. When referring to death, Kojève does not have in view the natural end of an organism, its biological demise. This would imply attributing the concept of subjectivity to all organic entities that have an end whose vital power can be exhausted. While biological end constitutes indeed an essential ingredient of Kojève's concept of death, without which this concept would be purely metaphorical, it is not the only one, and Kojève insists that the establishment of a relation to this end is an indispensable condition for death to become a constitutive dimension of subjectivity. This relation is articulated along distinct lines in Hegel and Heidegger, as a risk of life in the struggle of pure prestige, and as an advance toward the extreme, ultimate, and unsurpassable possibility of Dasein, that of no longer existing. However, in both cases, the anticipation of death renders the finitude of subjectivity transparent to itself. Now, insofar as man is the only being who not only dies, but can also anticipate his end and live in the horizon of his mortality, it follows that subjectivity is not only finite and mortal, but also human. However, although the existential analytic of being and time is determined by the same theoretical imperatives as those governing the project of the phenomenology of spirit, Kojève points out that these requirements receive in being and time a different accentuation, which has the effect of blunting their sharpness, of tempering their radicality. In particular, he claims that although Heidegger grants an indisputable preeminence in his analysis of subjectivity to the phenomena bearing negativity, such as anguish, death, or resolution, the adversative or even conflictive or violent dimension this phenomena harbor is blurred or insufficiently emphasized. Thus, I quote Kojève, everything that has to do with the element of negativity as such, which represents, however, the specifically human element in Hegelian anthropology, the active negative element is attenuated by Heidegger, end of quote. The narrowing of the scope of negativity testifies to an insufficiency in the phenomenological description and leads to two fatal consequences. On the one hand, it risks transforming the negating attitude into an attitude of passive contemplation, whereas its true meaning lies in its role as a vector of action, of confrontation with what hinders it, of active transformation of what is of the human and natural givenness. On the other hand, such attenuation of negativity harbors the danger of isolating the Dasein, of detaching it from its social and historical bonds, and thus paves the way for a, I use Kojève's expression, purely individualistic anthropology. However, following the slope of this extreme individualism, which is an unstable position, Heidegger exposes himself to the risk of falling back into a naturalistic anthropology, which erases the distinction between subjectivity and the thingish realities. According to this diagnosis, Heidegger had been unable to grasp negativity in all its breadth and has thus undermined the very principle of Hegel's phenomenological dualism. There is thus, at the phenomenological level, a Heideggerian setback with respect to Hegel, or again, there is a truth in Hegel's phenomenology which has not been consistently captured in being and time. But as soon as we shift the focus of the analysis to what we might call the architectonic level, the relationship between Hegel and Heidegger is reversed. Exploring the relation between phenomenological description and ontological research, Kojève points out a structural homology between their respective approaches. I quote him, "In fact, volume 1 of Sein und Zeit is nothing but an attempt to reproduce by rectifying it the phenomenological existential anthropology of the Phänomenologie des Geistes in view of an ontology, volume 2 not yet published, which should replace the distorted ontology of Hegel's logic." End of quote. Thus, on Kojève's view, the relationship between Hegel's phenomenology and his logic is analogous to the one between section 1 and 2 of Being and Time, the only ones published, and the third section, which was not published, but which Kojève was still expecting to be published in the 1930s. In both cases, an existential analysis of subjectivity constitutes the prerequisite for an inquiry into being as such. However, this architectonic symmetry does not diminish the gap between the two undertakings, which Kojève marks through terms such as rectification or replacement. Heidegger's rectification of Hegel's phenomenology is, as we have seen, fraught with considerable difficulties, in that it threatens the coherence of the phenomenological dualism put forward by Hegel. Consequently, this rectification is for Kojève unwarranted. On the other hand, he considers the replacement of the Hegelian ontology by Heidegger to be a legitimate enterprise, as it is capable of correcting the fallacy, the distortion of Hegel's logic. Now, in what consists the deficiency of Hegel's logic? Kojève explains this in detail in a passage worth quoting at length. I quote him. Hegel never wanted to admit even the possibility of challenging the traditional monistic postulate. All that is in one and the same way. And so his ontology is, as a whole, but a grandiose but complete failure. Stimulated by the rediscovery of philosophy by Husserl, Heidegger is the first after Hegel to have restated the ontological question in all its extent. And he's the first to address it without taking into account the supposedly obvious principle of monism. Of course, his ontology is only a program, but this program is such that it excludes the danger of repeating the ontological monism, which with Hegel seems to have exhausted all its possibility. Now, this passage allows us to see that what Kojève considers path-breaking in being and time are not the existentialist tropes, which were the main focus of attention in Heidegger's early reception in France, but rather the ontological project this work embodies. To put the matter more starkly, it is not the existentialist, but rather the ontological Heidegger, which Kojève considers to be decisive. Secondly, this passage allows us to pinpoint the tension which, on Kojève's account, runs through Hegel's work and which consists in the gulf between his dualistic phenomenological commitment and his ontological monism. Indeed, while the monistic dogma is challenged by Hegel at the level of the description of the appearing, he did not transpose this duality at the ontological level. In short, Kojève criticizes Hegel for not having been able to develop a dimorphic ontology able to account for the achievements which Kojève considers to be definitive of his phenomenological analysis, and in particular for the disparity between subject and substance, spirit and nature.
I'm sorry for interrupt. Yeah, perfect. You wrap it up.
We'll wrap it up in 1 minute.
Perfect.
What undermines the Hegelian construction, what constitutes, what makes the ontology of the logic distorted or fallacious is his adherence to ontological monism. However, the distinctiveness of Hegel's thought consists precisely in the dissociation of two historically inseparable positions, monism and naturalism. The static given being is certainly rejected by Hegel as the norm of all that is. However, this rejection does not lead him to admit that the norm of being is itself dual. The monistic postulate, all that is in one and the same way, remains operative, even though the meaning of what is has undergone the drastic metamorphosis, since it no longer designates the thingish being, but the spirit, which integrates negativity in itself. Hegelian monism is thus equivalent to a universalization of negativity. Thus, Hegel replaces traditional naturalistic monism with a dialectical monism. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ovidiu, for this. We're coming directly to the second speaker, which is Sophia Sorokina. And the title of her talk today is Does Cartesian cogito exclude or presuppose liberty? Interpretations of Kojève and Merab Mamardaschvili. And Sophia is affiliated with the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, more precisely with the School of Anthropology of the Future. And she studied political philosophy at the Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences, and both philosophy and at the Faculty of Psychology at Moscow State University. So I'm handing over to you, Sophia.
Thank you very much, Isabel. I really like the way Alexis started his speech by remembering his first professor that talked about Kojève. I'm lucky enough to have this professor here, who is Nicola, also known as Nicholas in our narrow Kojèvian circles. So I'm very grateful to him for bringing me into Kojève. And this speech would not be possible without him. So as Isabel already mentioned, the title of my speech of my work is Does Cartesian cogito exclude or presuppose liberty? I'm going to do a comparison of two authors, a comparison that may probably seem strange because these two authors are not usually put together. On the one hand, Kojève and Mamardaschvili are two thinkers situated in different cultural and historical contexts, or at least slightly different. I've never seen any evidence showing that these two authors have ever met, even though one was born in 1902 and the other in 1930. On the other hand, I suppose that their interpretations of Descartes provide an interesting starting point of discussion that may be developed not only around the difference in their understanding of Descartes himself, but also around differences and possibilities of solving individuality society problem that is one of the core philosophical ones. These are two different ontologies, the comparison of which may enrich understanding of how the individual society and liberty problems may at all be solved in different perspectives. One systemic, based on Hegelian one, the other one based on pre-Hegelian thought. Paradoxically, as we will see, hopefully, these two analyses coincide in some points, while vividly contrasting in others. Indeed, if Kojève prefers Hegelian systemic analysis with all its complexities that we've already discussed a lot during these last 3 days, Mamardaschvili stays one of the brightest representatives of another way of thinking, of pre-Hegelian current, if we can name it so, who mostly worked in Cartesian, Kantian, and Plato's thought. In some sense, we can say that these two thinkers present different ontologies, different currents and traditions. Kojève points in Sophia, the manuscript that I'm happy to read as far as I'm Russian, and that is the point of interest of so many people here. Kojève points there that Cartesian way of analysis was overcome in Hegelian system. Cartesian way of analysis for Kojève is an analyse causale, is a way of analysis of a thing and not of a human being. Kojève refers to Cartesian thought not as to Cartesian thought as such, but he illustrates his idea by referring to Descartes in order to show the whole pre-Hegelian tradition. Cartesian system stays limited for Kojève, limited first of all in a human way, limited in human opportunities of liberation from nature. Whilst Merab Mamardaschvili, who, starting by Marxist and Hegelian tradition in the beginning of his philosophical career, explicitly preferred pre-Hegelian currents later, at the end of his career. In his Cartesian Meditations, a cycle of public lectures given in Moscow Institute of Psychology in 1981, he associates Cartesian cogito with a condition of possibility of liberation. While, as I already said, for Kojève, cogito excludes liberation. So this contrast of interpretations seems to be a productive starting point for discussion. Now let's start with Kojève. He refers to Descartes in his introduction to the reading of Hegel and in the Buddha and Descartes text, recently transcribed and published. Kojève's Sophia, Phenomenology and Philosophy casts even more light to his interpretation of Cartesian cogito. By doing so, it also challenges, I suppose, the common understanding of Kojève as a Stalinist who tends to dissolve personality in society in a totalitarian manner, because in this text, Kojève's attention towards personality is quite present. It's quite evident that he pays attention to personality. According to Kojève, Descartes, first of all, betrays wisdom, which means for Kojève stops being a philosopher when he concludes that self or I exists from the simple fact of doubting and thinking. This same argument is more implicitly present in the text about Buddha and Descartes, where Buddha says that it doesn't necessarily follow from the fact of thinking that there is something that thinks, namely I, or the self of Descartes. So as Kojève puts it, Descartes states as an axiom something that itself needs clarification and justification. This is the first point of Kojèvian critics. This point is important for us because for Kojève, Cartesian formula is, paradoxically as it may seem, depersonalized. For Kojève, Cartesian analysis stays an analysis causal, as I already said, analysis of a thing, and not of a human being. Kojève insists that the Cartesian question was not who am I, but what am I? Indeed, Kojève accuses Descartes of depriving the individual of its personal and concrete characteristics due to the emptiness of the Cartesian self. Cogito formula is actually empty because the I is deprived of any concrete personality. This is supposed to be a universal formula, but it's not able even to characterize the personality. We can't, says Kojève, withdraw from Cartesian meditations, for example, who was Descartes, where he lived, what he did, etc. And it's not fine for a philosophical system, according to Kojève. In contrast, according to him, a real philosophical base should be able to grasp universal without sacrificing the particular, the individual, which is quite important in light of accusing Kojève of being a Stalinist, a totalitarian philosopher, and so on. It should be able, as Hegelian system, to rise from the abstract to concrete, and therefore include both individual and universal in itself. Kojève argues that the whole pre-Hegelian philosophy proposes the opposition between an abstract individual and empirical reality, an opposition that is unproductive for Kojève. Only Hegel was able to overcome this opposition, says Kojève. Moreover, this mental thing, this thinking being that is not a human being, this Cartesian thinking matter, is something that is able to exist only under the light of God. So this is another problem for Descartes, this dependence from God. This is this sort of divine dependence that Kojève criticizes as well, because of course, for him, this dependence means the inability of liberation, of human liberation. God must be replaced, according to him, by people who work and change and challenge reality. This is the other point of Kojèvian criticism. Descartes appeals to God without explaining explicitly why. But it's not only the divine character of explanation, or more precisely, the lack of explanation related to the faith, that doesn't satisfy Kojève. This position of abstract as an isolation means that this self is not communicating with any other self, which is quite important in Kojève's ontology and Hegelian ontology, as we know. It is not recognized by the others. It's not necessarily for this self to be recognized. It can exist without being recognized by someone. It is, in some sense, limited on itself. And here, the Hegelian critics of Stoicism comes into play. A Stoic for Hegel is limited on him or her own self, is deprived of possibility of liberation, therefore. Liberation is possible in Hegelian system, as already mentioned, through objective reality and relations with others. For Kojève, the emptiness and isolated character of the Cartesian cogito leads to a gnoseological rebonsonet, which in turn exclude possibility of liberation. The Kojèvian analysis can be further developed by appealing to the introduction to the reading of Hegel, so many times quoted in these 3 days, because there, elaborating on his master and slave dialectics, he points out that master is the one who loses in the end, because he is not able to free himself from nature by not having labor, by not working. If I'm a master and I lose this death struggle between slave and master because I'm deprived of labor that allows my emancipation. And Cartesian cogito is associated by Kojève with this position of a master. So as we see, Kojève doesn't accept Cartesian cogito for several reasons. Most importantly is the artificial, as he thinks, as he points, dissociation of an abstract individuality and empirical reality that was overcome only in Hegelian thought. Interestingly, and now I come to the second half of my speech, 40 years after Alexander Kojève made this interpretation, Merab Mamardaschvili proposed another reading of Descartes, which in turn presupposes cogito is the condition of possibility of liberation. Indeed, Mamardaschvili, Georgian Socrates, as we call him in Russia sometimes, who lived in the Soviet Union, his nonconformist life, regards cogito as an opportunity to liberate the self from different kinds of determinisms. It's important to mention that these determinisms are both inner and external, whilst the majority of Mamardaschvilian critics take into account only his temptation to avoid external determinism. This liberation, in turn, is often regarded by Mamardaschvili's opponents as an isolation in an inner fortress or or an invitation to a radical individualism. It is probably not the right place to stop in details on these critics and possible answers to it here. However, we argue that Mamardaschvili's position is much more complicated and is paradoxically comparable with the Kojèvian one. Indeed, though these authors make antagonistic conclusions about the emancipatory power of cogito, the understanding of liberty contains some interesting and potentially productive common points. This interconnection is even more interesting because the criticism proposed by Kojève towards Descartes is compatible with the one that Mamardaschvili elicited among his critics, and which, as we argue, is unjustified. These two thinkers, belonging to different philosophical traditions, are both often chosen subjects of labeling, being described as a Stalinist or an individualist and dissident, which in turn excludes the real understanding of their thoughts. So now let's turn to Mamardaschvili. His reading of cogito is related to a number of ideas that characterize his philosophy in general as a whole. For Merab and Mamardaschvili, the world is not there waiting for us. It is being created each second. It is being actually held by the human effort. Effort is quite important in his philosophical ontology. And it is actually held by the effort of particular people. Without this effort, writes Mamardaschvili, only house will be present. So his ontology is opposite to a passive waiting of the better world that is sometimes prescribed to him. He elaborated a special concept of metaphysical a posteriori, which means that something exists not from the beginning, but by my act of establishing it. The laws don't exist until we make and held them as he says it. And this is the position he attached to Descartes. So he says that Descartes, by his act of thought, interrogates and changes the world. For Mamardaschvili, Descartes is an absolutely existential character. He's the one who is able, as Mamardaschvili says, to repeat the formula of Rastignac, of Balzac, who said "à nous deux maintenant," between two of us. So it means that I'm able to engage myself existentially in a battle with this world in order to understand something, in order to, I am interested in truth more than I'm interested in myself. And I find that this point is very common between the two thinkers that I'm trying to analyze in my work. Cartesian doubt is a condition of possibility of an logical reduction is the second point that Mamardaschvili makes. So for him, doubt is not only to get rid of sensational canal of information, but also to get rid of cultural canal that I already know or think I know. So he emphasizes this part of Cartesian thought. This idea from Mamardaschvili stays, he points it for liberation from different determinisms, as I already mentioned. I remind you that he lived in the Soviet Union, being many times prosecuted. So staying accurate as we discussed with the sociology of knowledge, we can, however, propose that this philosophy, his philosophy and his life were probably closely connected. He had a strong desire to avoid external determinism, namely the ideological pressure of his time, which probably makes some critics think that he sometimes proposed a radical individualistic position. However, if we dive a bit more into details, we will see that this is a simplification, because cogito is, for him, actually a condition of possibility of universalization. So much of his thinking is about nature and experience of thought, which explains his interest in Descartes and Kant. The individuality of thought is for him an existential ground of thought as a universal being. So for him, thought and cogito is a condition of possibility of universalizing something. Without a thought and without doubting and without cogito, a civil society for him is not possible. So if for Kojève, cogito is the empty self, as I already stated, for Mamardaschvili, cogito is an opportunity to universalize through personalization, somehow paradoxically. According to him, so the civil society, as I already said, is possible only if there's a certain number of people who held a civil law alive. And they find that this is the other potential common point between these two thinkers. So I'm coming to conclusion now, freely, before Isabel does it for me. So we see that these two interpretations are quite different, even though paradoxically, the understanding of liberty originating from different philosophical backgrounds are not, as I tried to show, mutually exclusive. This leads us to the open question or questions, which I would repeat the Todd's question yesterday: is the marriage between phenomenology and dialectics possible? Because these two thinkers present two different traditions and they somehow don't understand liberty in an exclusive and mutually exclusive way, but they analyze the same philosopher, namely Descartes, in an opposite way. So my temporary conclusion is that we should not be attached to labels and should not be driven by labels as Stalinist or individualist, and go deeper into details, because probably those ontologies may tell us something more about how such different traditions may be put into a dialogue, or probably they cannot. So this is an open question that I would like to finish here. Thank you.
That was excellent. Thank you, Sophia. We're immediately coming to the third speaker, which is Nicola Sighinolfi, and he's speaking today about Kojève's Kant in the light of quantum physics. And Nicola is a former scholar of both the University of Pisa and La Sapienza University of Rome. And he received his bachelor's degree with a thesis on Kojève's seminar on Hegel. And after this, he received his master's degree in January this year with a thesis on Kojève's ontological dualism, working with Professor Luciano De Fiore and Professor Marina De Palo. And currently, Nicola is non-affiliated. And yeah, I'm handing over to you.
Wow. Good evening. First, I would like to thank the organizers and everyone who took part. It's been a wonderful workshop so far. It's a pleasure and an honor being part of it, and I'm quite emotional for being part of this kind of discussion, especially with Massimo Palma and Marco Filoni being present, whose books I possess and I've used in my very, very modest studies. I hope I can contribute to the discussion at least at a very small extent. It's my first time giving a talk in English, so I hope you will be forgiving. In my studies, I found that a major point in Kojève research for an ontology corresponding to his anthropology has always been the refusal of monism. As a consequence of that, nature is revealed as a concept able to give back the existent as an object, and at the same time revealing the object itself as much as a deontological status of human subject. This concept of nature reveals the finitude of man. As well as this, it reveals reality as an immediate given being, given-being. Kojève uses the image of the golden ring as a way to explain his ontological dualism. Today, I'll try to suggest that this fundamental theorization can be found in embryo in Kojève's early work, L'idée du déterminisme dans la physique classique et dans la physique moderne. And then I'll try to point out how some of the most original intuitions of this stage of Kojève elaboration will remain persistent in the late years, and specifically, we could find some tracks in the book dedicated to Kant. This belief is so strong in Kojève life that we can already find evidence of it in Latheism. Here, Kojève uses the Heideggerian concept of Dasein as being in the world, highlighting the contrast between Dasein and the word already given to him. This allows him to reject naturalistic or realistic issues. In Latheism, we can follow Kojève tracks as he is looking for an original answer to the ontological problem he already put as fundamental, defining the man as the presence of an absence. Latheism is a very, very dense text, and trying to unwrap it is far beyond the purpose of my speech. Nonetheless, referring to Heidegger's early influence on Kojève could be valuable for the sake of my point. I'm sorry and quite embarrassed because I will repeat some of the quotes and the points that Ovidiu already stressed out, but that's it. In Compare and Do the Tragique Existence by Alfred Delp, a review dated in 1936, Kojève lists what he considers the main issues raised by Sein und Zeit, stating how all of them descend from the common root of the Hegelian anthropology. So far along in 1936, Kojève cannot stick to the Heideggerian conclusions because he sees in Sein und Zeit a complete transfiguration of the Hegelian anthropology in which all the main categories are weakened. Here's a significant passage about the difference between Firsting and Arbeit. Please consider that most of the quotes are translated in English by me as I don't own English editions. I'm sorry for that. Firsting is the man achieving a goal, dominating, maîtrisant, the thing, and becoming his lord, maître, by comprehending it. In other words, giving it a name. This matches exactly to what Hegel says about Arbeit. But Hegel insists that Arbeit is always active negation of the form already given to the human being. Then follow a parenthesis. Hegelian Welt is created exclusively in and with the Arbeit properly so-called, while Heideggerian Welt is Welt and is not Natur, already for the simple reason of the presence of Befindlichkeit. The exciting part to me is the one in the parentheses. Kojève here leads the Heideggerian Dasein as being able to make the Natur becoming the Welt simply being present, simply being true own. And while that sounds like something that could add value to the human life, for Kojève means plain and simple a surrender. In Kojève anthropology, human being is beforehand plural, while Dasein, as he reads it, could exist without the involvement of the other human being. You can have individualization and never have society nor history. There is an unbridgeable gap here between the two philosophers, because Kojève does not intend to concede on what he considers one of his main points, the strong characterization of the negative as, in Vincent de Comte's words, humanization of the nihil. So why is Heidegger so important to Kojève, even if he cannot follow his tracks? And here's another quote from the same review of Alfred Delp. It's only by comparing him with Hegel that we can see what's new in Heidegger philosophy. Now it seems that these news exist and exist as a definitive acquisition of philosophy. This new acquisition is the resolute acceptance of ontological dualism, of the essential difference of and ontological irreducibility between the human being, Dasein, and the natural being, Vorhandensein. As I was saying, the research for an ontological dualism has always been a major point in Kojève's works. In year after Lateism, Kojève wrote down the essay on determinism. In a completely different context and in some way in a very specialized text, he raises the same ontological question. Here, Kojève turns his attention with an interesting, very early insight to the biggest news in science, the quantum physics revolution. A twist so strong in physics that was able to put an end to the positivistic claim of classical physics for universal causality. One of the major consequences of these overwhelming changes in physics that Kojève was interested in is the fact that the unity of the notion of reality has been broken irreparably. This happened because the quantum physics revolution has introduced an unavoidable dualism between the observer and the observed. And here's a quote from L'idée du déterminisme. The classical idea of a world in itself, as it could exist regardless any observation, has no longer any physical meaning, either as a limiting case or as a regulator idea. In its place, modern physics put the limiting case of the world just as it is given to the ideal experimenter, who carries out experiments as accurately as possible. Kojève intervenes in the philosophical debate ignited by the discoveries in quantum physics field, a debate already carried out by some of the philosophers protagonists in the 30s. It is interesting to note some similarities between Kojève's assumption and those of Ernst Cassirer in his determinism and indeterminism in modern physics. Even more so if we underline that Kojève was a close reader of the neo-Kantian works. In this respect, it is useful to draw attention to Giampiero Chivilot's suggestion towards the actual reception of neo-Kantian influence on Kant. One could say that the persistence on temporality of human reality, ruled by the primacy of the future, has to be purely an Heideggerian derivation. By reading some of his texts, we can change our mind, because Kojève received suggestions from neo-Kantian and Jewish philosophy. This quote is from the introduction to Oltre la Phenomenologia, a collection of reviews mostly written from Recherche philosophique, including note inédite sur Hegel et Heidegger, and the reviews about the book of Delp. Here, Kojève makes explicit reference to Hermann Cohen as the one who rediscovered the primacy of the future in human temporality. Cassirer understood with amazing clarity the significance of the latest scientific discoveries, and notably the question raised in front of all the neo-Kantian philosophers. In his 1921 book, Einstein's Theory of Relativity, Cassirer clearly explains the risks for the critical philosophy to sink together with Newtonian physics. Nonetheless, he rises to the challenge and turns the tables, declaring the theory of relativity the fulfillment of critical philosophy program. Kant's critique of pure reason, says Cassirer, was never intended to bind philosophy to a determined, dogmatic conceptual system. Instead, its goal was to open philosophical knowledge to the safe path of science. In L'idée du déterminisme, Kojève seems aware of the problem on the same terms, even if he's far more concerned about the relation between Kant's teachings and science. And I quote, "Too often in history of philosophy, pure physics notions have been transferred literally into metaphysics and present as absolute a priori truths. We must always keep in mind the example of a thinker like Kant as a recall to caution." What matters most to Kojève here is to clarify that the problem of physical determinism is not to be confused with the problem of free will. In physics, there's no place to such a thing as will, and the question of knowing if it is free or determined cannot be asked. Kojève wants to avoid any kind of anthropomorphism of nature and its components. Otherwise, the area of irreducibility in the relationship between observer and observed, opened by the news in physics science, will close. This need will remain pivotal, it's my thinking of it, in the years of the seminar. In the third section of the book, titled "The Idea of Determinism in Modern Physics," Kojève widely discussed the theories of the prominent scientists linked to the quantum physics revolution, such as Bohr, Heisenberg, de Broglie, Dirac, Schrödinger, and many others. I want to focus to what seemed to me the most important point in Kojève's summary. The quantum physics laws confirms the urgency for investigation of a proper ontological dualism. He says, "What's really new in Heisenberg theory and make it specifically modern or quantistic is the fact that it reveals the existence of a constant limit, absolute and universal in the precision of the physical observation." This quote is important because later in the book, Kojève will discuss and reject the phenomenist interpretation of the quantum physics discoveries. Kojève underlines what he considers, among the other credits gives to the modern physicists, the prominent one. They note that the very structure of reality is such that even the most ideal observation does not give us reality in itself, as it is independent from the observation. More importantly, experience is a real interaction between the observant system and the observed system, and the result of this interaction is what embodies the result of experience. The main consequence of this result is that, and I quote, "The modern physics isn't more idealist or more subjectivist or more phenomenist than was classical physics. On one hand, the observed system is not less real than the observer system, and it is independent for the observer regarding his being. Their interaction, during which they are both really modified, it is also substantial. On the other hand, the set formed by the two systems, it is also objective and substantial, as it exists regardless empirical subject or nosological subject." This sentence looked to me like an early attempt to conceptualize the ontological dualism in the same form which later would be described by the golden ring image. Further into the book, Kojève sums up and rejects the phenomenist interpretation of quantum physics, influenced by the works of Ernst Mach. For the phenomenist interpretation, not only there is no real metaphysical in itself world, strictly speaking, there's not even longer an essential opposition between subject and object inside the phenomenon. There is only one reality, and this reality is composed by a series of data of consciousness, which following Mach we could call sensation. Kojève refused this interpretation because accepting it would result in refusing the actual existence of the interaction, as well as the absolute irreducibility between the subject and the object. Kojève seems really careful to refuse any possible subjectivism inherent to the theory of quantum physics. Describing the Bohr-Heisenberg interpretation, he states, and I quote, "The physical world is the world composed of data given to the ideal experimenter. It is not a metaphysical in itself world, because its definition implies being given to a subject. But this definition is not idealistic. The physical reality is not referred neither to the concrete human being nor to the nosological subject, so that it is absolutely independent from them in regards of its existence. There is no solipsism nor idealism. Even if it is inseparable from the subject, the physics given is not completely subjective. It is not the subject who creates its object. Instead, this object is real in the strongest meaning of the word." Going on, we could observe the affinity between Kojève and Cassirer in regard to quantum physics, even from a different perspective. In Kojève's system, the anthropogenetic desire plays a key role. Main feature of this desire are its relational dimension and its essential negativity. Somehow, Cassirer anticipates some of these arguments and later will develop them in the philosophy of symbolic forms. Using the concept of relativity borrowed from the physics, he problematized the concept of concrete reality, showing the illusory nature of its alleged simplicity and uniqueness. While different fields of human knowledge require and imply different concepts of reality, the task of philosophy is to free the image of the real world from a unilateral conception. Cassirer investigation reached its climax on reflection about the status of the object in physical studies and its relationship with philosophy. The development of physics science is characterized for being more and more functional and less substantial, and theory of relativity is the turning point in this path. Object in physics is an ideal object, and no theory of physics science has ever referred to actual facts of perception. We never deal with things, but only with object validity of certain relation. Einstein's theory of relativity deserves credit for having brought to completion the removal of any kind of anthropomorphism in physics. It is exactly in this very spot that Cassirer points out the connection between theory of relativity and critical philosophy. The new epistemology implied by the new physics is not external, but it's inherent to the theory of relativity. Nonetheless, states Cassirer, any kind of dogmatism must be avoided. And I quote Cassirer from Einstein's theory of relativity. In any creative age, physics find and elaborate new dimensions and constants that describe the totality of being. But at the same time, in those measures, provisional and relative, from time to time consider the last, every age is likely to see the definitive expression of ontological reality. In this respect, Kojève expressed similar feeling, stating that the philosophers must catch the physical theories, how they are among the scientists, and dodge as much as possible statements which assume the eternity of the theory itself. What's at stake here, it's not an unlikely similarity between Cassirer and Kojève, rather to show how a shared demand to face the groundbreaking news in physics motivated both, each in its particular way, on the path for a reformulation of the spiritual dimension of reality, and both in a transformative sense. The subject of parallel with certain themes of critical philosophy acquires an interesting meaning in relation to Kant, the posthumous book by Kojève dedicated to the German philosopher. From the very beginning of the book, the goal is made clear: to free Kant's system from the prison of the thing in itself, thus removing its transcendental appendix and making it atheistic without fall for a skeptic outcome. And I quote from Kant. Le maintien par Kant de la notion de la chose en soi classée son système parmi les systèmes rationalistes classiques, qui sont d'inspiration théiste. De même, le dualisme irréductible de la volonté et de la raison, ou plus exactement l'entendement, c'est-à-dire l'action et du discours, fait du système kantien un système philosophique païen ou antique, où la nature ou le sens de l'homme, partout et toujours identique à elle-même, lui est donné en fonction de la place immuable qu'il occupe au sein du cosmos ou du monde naturel. During the 50s, Kojève is busy working on the Kant manuscript and is already busy in his second talks on the theory of the end of history. At this stage, the main problem is still the one of temporality. In Kant, the philosopher, temporality is inadequately proposed, and thus in Kojève's end is rearranged in the shape of space temporality, and in turn divided in categories of given being, objective reality, and empirical existence. And the last quote, I swear. Kant parle uniquement du temps, tandis que nous parlons de spatio-temporalité. Kant ne connaît qu'un seul schéma temporel, ou en fait spatio-temporel, tandis que nous en distinguons trois. La catégorie de l'être donné par la spatio-temporalité, celle de la réalité objective par l'espace-temps, et celle de l'existence empirique par la durée attendue. To rearrange the notion of space temporality, Kojève makes use of his typical themes. Human temporality is characterized by the primacy of the future, the project against the nature emerging from nature itself, and the primacy of the future means the primacy of the inexistent, or in other words, primacy of the human action, free and project-driven, negative action embodied. Kant appears keen to maintain the notion of the thing in itself only for practical purposes, to guarantee the possibility of a free human action. I want to conclude my talk with an open point. I hope it's open. Despite cutting the transcendency of the thing in itself, Kojève does not look like he could put a full stop to the fundamental ontological problem of his philosophy. His project remains to close the circle of history of philosophy, and we can see him pushing Kant philosophy and his interpretation of Kant towards his interpretation of Hegel, assimilating his own categories, even though of the practical reason, to the Kojèvian Hegel. In front of him, a crossroad opened up once again, even in the late stage of his life. On one hand, the struggle against the ontological monism, and on the other one, the relational interpretation of Kant. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nicola. This was excellent. We're coming to our final speaker today, which is a great shame, but we're happy to having one more beautiful talk before we entering into our discussion and maybe into our more informal discussion afterwards. And our last speaker is Hager Weslati, and she teaches courses on media technologies and cultures at Kingston University in London. And she translated Kojève's The Notion of Authority, 2014. And there's also an upcoming translation of the Kant book we just heard about from Nicola, which is to appear with Verso in the next year, alongside a forthcoming monograph titled Alexandre Kojève, A System of Knowledge. And Hager's talk today is called Kojève, Sophia, Bored Girls, and the Philosopher in the Striped Pyjamas. Over to you, Hager.
Okay, I believe you can hear me, and I have to apologize straight away if my internet collapses, okay? So what a formidable responsibility to speak last, although I did entertain perhaps the temptation not to speak at all. So I'm going to start with my conclusion in case I run out of time and in case Isabel uses her authority and silences me. So here's my conclusion. Regarding progress that has so far been made in engaging the Kojèvian legacy, a decent amount of work has been done in the biographical department. Similarly, the study of isolated or autonomous fragments, which all come under what I call the piecemeal approach, not in a derogatory sense, of course, have also contributed immensely to stressing Kojève's relevance to debates in contemporary philosophy and numerous other disciplines. However, very little has been achieved as far as the systematic approach is concerned. So in my, I believe that we still need to understand the Kojèvian system of knowledge, figure out how it works, because it's not an edifice, really, it's a machine, it works. And also we have to engage with its concrete applications. So let's then see how we can use the three approaches to study the question of woman. Starting with the biographical puzzle, Kojève reading Sagan. You heard some comments on the text today. In the concluding seminar 4 on the object relation in the summer of 1957, Lacan assigned this riddle as a summer reading to his student analysts, and he advised them to take the austere philosopher, high-ranking diplomat's interest in Sagan seriously. Now, Jacques-Alain Miller completed his homework assignment 3 decades later, at the height of the Lewinsky-Clinton scandal, implying that Sagan's New World was not only for little Hans and the baby boomers, and that it may well be with us today. It's a world bereft, as you know, of virile masculinity. What interests me is the political consequences that Miller draws from this idea of man does not exist, and from the social decline of the paternal imago. So listen to Miller. He thinks it's absolutely devastating to end up in this horrific world of the all together, the all the same, le tous pareil, of democracy. So Jacques-Alain Miller completed the historical and literary figures of the virile masquerade with 2 portraits. Lacan, the subject supposed to know, his father-in-law, is cast in the role of the dandy, the Brummel of psychoanalysis, while Kojève, the philosopher of the end of history, is cast in the role of Valentin Bru, the voyou désœuvré of the European community. So lapsing into the biographical, neither Miller nor Éric Laurent in a more recent piece is able to explain what Sagan, Cécile, and Dominique are doing in Kojève's philosophy. In the Unpresentable, an investigation into the literary filiation of philosophy, Lacoue-Labarthe saw in Hegel's uneasiness with Schlegel's losing something more than a concern with the epoch's aesthetic dissolution, its moral turpitude, its dissipation. Rather, it is Hegel's entire speculative system, Krell argues, that has something to fear from Lucin's sensuous abandon. Krell concludes that Hegel's system confronts the following predicament. If woman were purged from the system, spirit would die. Remaining within the system, however, woman condemns spirit to a fate worse than death. It's worth noting that Meillassoux with his sirens, and then you've got Badiou and a whole lot of love. They've done something quite interesting with this kind of question. So my question here was Kojève seeing in Sagan, Cécile, and Dominique, Hegel's famous claim that describes woman as the eternal irony of the community. And I have to skip a section here on the treatment of this theme in feminist philosophy. I reach a conclusion, though, where I ask, this is the point I get to via that survey of specific texts. I think that with Cécile or Dominique, we are not inviting to think gender with irony, but rather to think gender with boredom. There's a very important nuance here, but not any kind of boredom. You read Sagan, you find out that it's the boredom that finds Bergson naive, that finds Epicurean philosophy insufferable. It's also the kind of boredom that can quote from Kant at boring, very bourgeois dinner tables. We can reconstruct the scene of Kojève's reading Sagan from his correspondences. As you know, it's Schmidt, from his own photography in the middle of the 50s, from details in his diplomatic missions during those years, and even with reference to interesting films he may have seen, namely, you know, Kurosawa's Seventh Samurai. We do know that he was bedridden for a lengthy period of time, and we can picture him, hence my title, we can picture him in his striped pajamas, those, I quote Kojève, casual and comfortable Occidental garments from the effeminate Indies, which had conquered the free Western world thanks to the British conquerors of the servile Orient. Now, those biographical details are, of course, useful. And if I had time, I could show you how they actually resonate with key themes in Kojève's philosophy. You probably can do that on your own. But again, I fast forward to my conclusion from the biographical approach. And here's my position on indulging the biographical approach while neglecting the systematic approach. The excessive use of the biographical approach reinforces the notion of duplicity, the absolute unknowability of Kojève. You heard some, Espoir's position on that. Some biographical references are tangled in, I believe, with racist overtones, as in the heterogeneity of l'âme slave, as a colleague from Russia was telling me 2 days ago. So if we remain limited to the biographical approach, if I come back to the feminine or the question of woman, we see the question of woman actually frozen in the absolute unknowability and the alleged secretiveness of Kojève's life and character. I wonder what we will make of his, photography now and the restaging of the origin of the world. There are some fascinating things, but you have to think of this man from Russia with the camera in the midst of the orgies of the 1930s. Never mind. So I'm moving on. Are you going to silence me, Isabel? Already?
Not anytime soon. No, I think you have 10 minutes more to go, maybe even 12.
Okay, I'll take less than that, and please feel free to move on to the Zoom drinks already, okay? Right, so I want to say a few words now about the reading Kojève in fragments, or what I call the piecemeal approach. Here I have to apologize to colleagues who have interest in feminist philosophy, because this is where I use some really interesting references, and then I end up referring to why it's better to read, Kojève's treatment of women with Barad rather than, say, for example, with de Beauvoir, but never mind. But the point I make here is that, like the biographical approach, the piecemeal approach, reading Kojève in fragments will sooner or later encounter contradictions and puzzles. And this is the thing that I heard over and over again over the last 3 days. It's like we always encounter that text, that fragment in Kojève's which we are unable to place anywhere in his thought or connect with his personality. So using the question of woman as an example, you can find different irreconcilable positions in different fragments. This is where I skipped the section on Laurent Bibard, where you learn that you can pray like a woman, but you can work like a woman, but you cannot fight like a woman, so on and so forth. We also mentioned Shadia Drury. And then we read in a fragment in the Sophia Philosophia, which I had access to, and I have to thank Nicola Rambert and Evgeny for their generosity. And we find something quite interesting, this distinction between the revolutionary and socialist realization of self-consciousness in women, this becoming self-aware of women, and the self or consciousness or the becoming self-conscious of the proletariat. And here, I invite you to an interesting comparative reading, perhaps with Butler's theory of assembly. Women, Kojève says, who were trapped in the pseudo-philosophical theologism of the revelations of divine men, frozen in the image of the ideal woman, who never really existed, are now raised to the plane of authentically philosophical self-consciousness. And these women, what do they want? They're not all bored. They actually, not only do they want to speak, but they also want to speak about themselves, speaking about themselves. And some of you may recognize a Kojèvian formula there, or even a Lacanian one, but never mind. So finishing now with a systematic approach. Now, here I need to make another perhaps aggressive claim. And the point perhaps I validate in more details in the book is that claims that the Kojèvian system does not exist, the naivety of saying that it's a book, you don't find a system in a book. I think these claims are not as innocent as we think. The system actually is not a book in the vulgar sense of the term. Its major outlines have been completed before the lectures on Hegel, believe it or not. I explain in my book how I arrived at this conclusion, but for now I can share with you the most relevant consequences of this understanding of the system regarding the question of women in bullet points. So the systematic approach allows you to see the end of history, but also it allows you to engage with and understand bad infinity. This is the blind spot in most readings of Kojève. The systematic approach also allows you to understand the primacy of the notion of revolutionary action okay, like his treatment of the notion of tyranny or authority and so on and so forth. Also its centrality to the problem of knowledge. So if we follow these threads, we arrive at interesting conclusions when we frame the question of boredom with revolutionary action, with the existential attitudes of bad infinity. You have the Stoics, you have, the skeptics, so on and so forth. And if we frame it with the parathetic philosophical discourse, another key conceptual term in the Kojèvian system that we need to pay close attention to. In his 1952-53 manuscript on Kojève, on Kant, slip of the tongue, Kojève writes that he is in agreement with Kant's notion of the moral law and freedom having in the final analysis one and the same meaning, which derives its ultimate source from the consciousness of the desire of desire, that is to say, from the desire for recognition and from boredom. In the longer version of the paper, I'm going to conclude soon, I discussed the spirit of Antigone, and this is a phrase from Kojève with reference to bad infinity. And then I link the figure of the Sophia with reference to the system's plane of objective reality. And actually, Nicola, what you were describing there are, sides, textual fragments where Kojève opened the question of, objective reality. So when we focus on the figure of the Sophia, and actually he studies, and this is another claim I make, he studies at least the French version of his Sophia is an integral part of the fragments that deal with objective reality. So we need to distinguish Kojève's thesis on Soloviev in the 20s and 30s. In the French version, Kojève was attentive to how Sophia navigates the Solovievian system. Pay attention to her journey in the doctrine of God and then in the doctrine of world. And he actually believed that modern physics, he says this openly, can provide a perfectly acceptable translation of Soloviev's application of his mystical sociology to the doctrine of God. But where is the problem? A more serious problem arises when the rebellious Sophia enters the empirical world, where she can choose not to join Soloviev's theocratic society of the brothers in the figures of the priests, warriors, and prophets. She doesn't want to belong to any of these societies. I use Bataille's short article in Documents on base materialism and Gnosticism as a useful reference to make sense of all this, because Bataille's base matter remains external and foreign to ideal human aspirations. It's probably not as adventurous as Kojève's Sophia as he describes her here. And he tells us, he ends actually his French, the French version of his thesis, or whatever, the second article, he ends it on a rather scandalous note. And where's the scandal? He tells us if God is not interested in revealing himself through Sophia's free and contingent acts, should he not leave Sophia alone? I mean, what does he want? What is God trying to do? That reminds me of a pop song, but never mind. What God was doing, what he wants to do, is not to obliterate chaos. It's not to reveal himself or bring back the world into his kingdom. God wants to suppress Sophia's freedom. So this conclusion actually resonates with the famous passage in the introduction, the last year of the seminar, where he states that the revolutionary choice is between either oneself against God or oneself with God against oneself. There is no reason for the decision other than the decision itself. So coming to my conclusion now, already at the end of 1937, Kojève, and I'm going to be a little bit comical and dramatic here, okay? Kojève sent his Parisian audience home. Just imagine him sending everybody home, just go home, circuler, il n'y a plus rien à voir. He's basically telling them explicitly that the show is over, history ended. And he asked his audience for one more effort if they want to be revolutionaries, to recognize philosophy as a road that actually leads to wisdom, because Kojève tells us, and I'll quote it in French because it hasn't been included in the English version of the lectures. He says, il y a toujours eu une philosophie à la base de toute révolution. So one can only imagine, 1937, one can only imagine his horror when instead of receiving something from the tyrant worthy of his desire, I'm not going to name anybody, he actually received a letter from Bataille featuring the man of unemployed negativity, a negativity empty of content, and a refutation, Bataille tells him, of Hegel's closed system. So the question here, can a future revolution be founded on the Bataillean system of non-knowing? Kojève, I'm done now. Kojève says that it's very unlikely, even though he concedes that inactive anarchy, as he calls it, also demands to be recognized, and that error can be as circular as truth. So if his references to Napoleon are not actually exalting a hero, but rather conjuring up the ghost of a dead revolution and the spirit of its philosopher grave digger, because that's what he calls Hegel, Kojève was perhaps holding up a mirror to his own contemporaries to highlight their uncanny proximity to the false consciousness, the radical alienation and self-deception, the tragedies and farces of the Christian bourgeois aesthetes, philosophers, moralists, and intellectuals, in the build-up to the Great Prussian defeat and the spectacular collapse of the Reich at the turn of the 19th century. Now, for us today, we can see resonance of Sagan's bored girls and virile masquerades, for those who are familiar with these kind of shows, in Love Island. What's the difference between Sagan and Love Island? We can see the question of women reposed in the Texan abortion law, or in the rise of the Taliban. And then this piece of news from China 2 days ago, the media regulator in China declared a war on the country's reality shows. And I'm quoting here, their abnormal aesthetics of sissy men with lapsed morals. The regulator is hoping to create, I quote, love for the party and the country and respect for morality and art. Finally, Kojève's system of knowledge is a product of its time. It was built in conversation with his contemporaries. It acknowledges the bad infinity of his time. One of the key formulas of his system of knowledge can be phrased as follows. Do we live, act, and speak in a world where empirical existence is supported by objective reality and accords with its given being? If yes, then we should be fully satisfied. But if not, we need to understand what causes our empirical existence to be inadequate to an objective reality. Is the being about which we speak possible in the world in which we act? Are we faced with a real that resists action while being defenseless against our preposterous discourses? what can be said and what can be done in the world in which we live in today. And I'm done. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hager. And wonderful that our last talk ended on the unlikely topic of Chinese reality TV. So what do we feel? Are we directly going into our questions, or do people want to have a small break? What do you think, Trevor? Kyle?
I don't want to make a decision for everyone. Isa, you're in charge. I'll let you make a decision.
Maybe we go into the questions and then see that we go into a slightly more informal setting where everyone can pop out, have a drink. But maybe we get on with the questions we're having while the speakers are still active and everyone is still. What do we think? Agreed. Yeah. Thank you, George. Okay. I have 2 questions already from the chat, which I would like to start with. The first one is from Kyle. Would you like to speak, Kyle, or do you want me to read it?
I mean, I can speak, but it'd just be basically to reiterate the question that I've already posted for Ovidiu. I mean, just seeing what I wrote, but no, I was just thinking about this idea of Heidegger in relationship to Hegel, and also this and the product of this engagement, ontological dualism, and of course this plays a large role in the introduction, if we can call it the earlier Kojève work. But when he gets to the later system, post-war writings, Heidegger sort of drops out. And at the very beginning of the concept time and discourse, he does make reference to Heidegger, acknowledging the debt of his thinking, but then quickly turns against Heidegger by claiming he turned out badly for this unfortunate desire to want to go beyond Hegel through returning to, and then he lists various Greek philosophers. And I was wondering if what does this do for your thesis? What does this do for your understanding of ontological dualism, considering as well the fact that ontological dualism itself is not a term that appears in his later work, or none that I'm aware of, at least.
And it's also not a term that appears in Heidegger's works. So what is interesting is that Heidegger never himself described his position in these terms, in terms of ontological dualism. So this is a term of Kojève's creation, and it's interesting to see what is the theoretical place it occupies within Kojève's discourse. Now, I think your question has this different levels, right? And I think I can try to answer it differently. So first of all, we may ask ourselves biographically, right, whether Kojève actually wanted or not to associate his thinking with Heidegger, Heidegger who turned out badly, right? And I think I haven't mentioned this in the presentation, but I've noticed that in the introduction, I mean, in the very first pages of the introduction, where Hegel says that the method of the phenomenology of spirit is phenomenological in the modern sense, that is the Husserlian sense, right? If you look at the resume published, the abstract published in the Annales de l'École Pratique, you have the same wording. It's exactly the same text. There is just one word that is different. Instead of Husserlian in 1933, you have Heideggerian, right? So it's something like in 1947, he wanted, I mean, this is a small, in this, a small reference that might help us to see that he might have wanted also to dissociate himself from Heidegger. But there is a second point, and I don't know whether this was sufficiently clear in my presentation. What I meant was that the Heidegger that most interests Kojève is not the existentialist Heidegger, but the ontological Heidegger, but not the ontological Heidegger in the sense of what now we consider to be the ontological Heidegger, that is the ontohistorical Zeitgeschichtliche Heidegger, but the ontological Heidegger as it would appear for a reader of Being and Time in the 1930s. And what would the reader of Being and Time in the 1930s expect? Well, the publication of the second part of Being and Time, right? At that moment, Kojève, as many other intellectuals, waited for this publication. They saw it pending, right? And it is precisely in this second part that, according to Kojève, this ontological dualism would have been properly unfolded, right? So in a certain sense, he bases his adherence, his allegiance to Heidegger on the unpublished part of Being and Time, right? Now, in the 1940s, everyone already knew, Heidegger changed the subtitle first part of Being and Time and said, okay, there will be no second part. And in a certain sense, the promise contained in this project vanished. And this might be a more substantial reason for abandoning. And the third level of my answer would be, now, of course, there are no more references or no massive references to Heidegger. But if we also look in the text of the introduction, you have like 10, 12 references, most of them in footnotes, right? So then the question would be, is in Kojève's later work still present what he deemed to be the major advance of Heidegger's position, that is ontological dualism? And I think that it is an open debate, right? I think it is an open debate. I think there are texts, even from the 50s and 60s, where Kojève explicitly and radically distinguished between discursive knowledge and sort of non-discursive knowledge, which is either mystical or scientific, right? And if we distinguish, if we maintain the difference between, let's say, the concept and the algorithm, I think that the underlying principle of the ontological dualism is fundamentally maintained, right? So no more reference to Heidegger, but what he wanted to do through Heidegger in the 30s is, in a certain sense, maintained. Now, I understand that with the energology, all this might become more complex. I don't have an answer to this, but yeah, this is what I wanted to say.
Thanks very much, Ovidiu, for that. The next question goes to Teresa. You pulled up your hand.
Thank you, Isabel. I have something to say and then a comment and a question, so sorry. What I want to say is that unfortunately I will have to leave in 15 minutes, 10 minutes, so after my questions and the answer to my questions. So I want to thank everyone for this wonderful workshop. And then I have a comment and a question for Hager. So I could not resist when you asked the question, can we found a revolutionary philosophy on Bataille? I cannot resist but to answer yes, we can. And I know I should not do that, but I would like to refer to a paper I published in an edited book on Bataille's thought, where I try to argue for a Bataille's philosophy of the state. And for me, it's very important to put my own understanding, of Bataille's philosophy of the state, which is quite paradoxical, right? Because no one would say Bataille has a philosophy of the state, together with Kojève. And I think it's very important to use both the resources of these two thinkers to think political philosophical questions here and now together. So that I could not resist, sorry. And then I have one question for you, which is a bit broad, but why do you think there is not a systemic understanding of Kojève so far? And I will read your book with a lot of interest. Why do you think, this is also the question I asked in my specific sector. For me, it's incredible how the outline of the phenomenology of law is so little commented by political philosophers. So why is that? Why we don't have, and we will have it with your book, I hope, but why did it take so long? Thank you.
Sorry, can I answer that quickly, Teresa? I'd love to have a conversation with you. I know you have to dash off, but a very, very quick answer. I think Kojève connects the phobia of systems to the fear of action in general and revolutionary action in particular. There's also the issue of not considering Kojève as a systematizer. And I connect this with some, as I said, in a straightforward way, a racist overtone, a resistance in Western philosophy, in the Western philosophical canon, to the ideas of the other. Okay? And I think Kojève was so cunning and strategically efficient when he packaged his thought to his audiences as a commentary on Hegel. But I can actually argue that the lectures on Hegel, I'm going to review, well, I don't know, it's a position, and then I want people to engage with me and discuss it and so on and so forth. It's not indisputable truth, but we present evidence. And I think that the lectures were actually a working site to complete two essential elements in the system, which are a philosophy of discourse and a philosophy of action. So he opened the question of action and discourse, and you have to understand, and I honestly struggled. I've been doing this for 10 years, much to my shame, and I published virtually nothing because I encountered some serious issues. It's like, oh my God, where does this fragment fit? And I have to tell you that it was only very recently that I worked out where action and discourse fit in the system. And I can tell you straight away that it was partly thanks to the manuscript on Kant. And one final thought before you go, Kojève, when he engages with other philosophical systems, he says you cannot engage, deconstruct another philosophical system. You cannot fight it. You cannot struggle with it, whatever you want to say it, unless you have a system as well. You have to be resting on a system yourself in order to fight another system. Otherwise, you would be doing the work of critique and whatever. But it's a long, you know, I mean, I don't know, but I would love to have a conversation with you at one point. I would gladly read what you wrote on that time.
Thanks for that, Hager. I think we're all very excited about your book and your thoughts about the system. And I'm reading out one question Hager put in the chat a while ago before I'm coming to Danilo, Terry, and George's questions. So it's a question for Nicola, and Hager asks, the essay on physics is definitely in conversation with neo-Kantian philosophers, but to what extent can we say that it is also in conversation with and even informed by some trends in Soviet science? If you want to comment on that.
Yes, and there's an addition from Jorge that I would like to include in the question, if it's possible. Then it refers to the debate between Lenin and Bogdanov about the Mach theories in Russia. And I think that Kojève was well aware of this debate. And Of course, being so prominent the necessity of ontological dualism in this phase of his life, Kojève must reject both the Bogdanov and Machian interpretation of the new theories in physicists and the Lenin one. We already heard in the past days as Kojève rejects dialectical materialism of Marxism. And to me, there's a subterranean tracks to follow in this debate. And it's the fact that when Kojève interacts with Marx and Marx theories, it looks like to me that Lenin is one of his targets. In mostly the theory of revolution that Lenin put in State and Revolution, for example, and other books, because the Leninist theory of revolution merged together irreparably the dialectical Marxism and the theory of revolution. And to me, what Kojève is looking for in the Marx text is just what can be used in his anthropology. So mostly the manuscript, the economical, philosophical manuscripts, and few other concepts. So the refusal of the Bogdanov conception and the Lenin conception is inside the urgence for Kojève for an ontological dualism. And Bogdanov and Lenin were both, to me, monistic thinkers, because they were linked to the dialectical materialism, and nor Bogdanov, neither Bogdanov nor Lenin could be useful for Kojève in any kind of interpretation of the quantum physics revolution. So that's my point on that.
Thanks for that answer. Danilo, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yeah, there's now a bit of a time lag, unfortunately, because I kind of followed on from Carl's question to Ovidiu, and as I just realized, because I recognize the days, we've obviously been with colleagues at Sciences Po ages ago, and so it's great to see you again. And yeah, I really liked the talk. It was an extremely cogent and dense and rigorous. I've never seen this sort of relationship between Heidegger and Kojève structured in such a condensed manner. And I think the only, I mean, one is just a comment, is that sort of in terms of doing historical justice, maybe, is that I was really struck because there's a bit of resentment among people who work on Alexander Kojève that he's never quite reached the limelight in the way Alexander Kojève has. And I think one particular instance where that's certainly true is that a significant part of Kojève's appropriation of Heidegger's thinking owes a lot to Alexander Kojève. Certainly the sort of taking the finitude from Heidegger and back onto Hegel, and the futurity, basically, that I say Hegel is a philosopher of thinking futurity. And then even later, shortly after the war, he has this idea that Heidegger's philosophy is very good at saying yes, but I'm completely incapable of saying no. That's also something he would share. And I think Max Scheler was the first, when Kojève reviewed Max Scheler, and he saw there this comment that Heidegger is actually not very good at thinking and conceptualizing genuine intersubjectivity. I think there, but it doesn't really take anything away from what you said, but I just think I kind of was led to revise my own point of view, that just how indebted Kojève was to Corey and maybe Max Scheler there. And the second, that's more like where I would maybe part ways a little bit, is just that this idea, yeah, it's a very interesting claim that he wasn't interested in the existentialism of Heidegger, but in the ontology, right? And that, I mean, the problem with that term is that everyone wanted to be an existentialist in the first 2 years, and then no one wanted to be an existentialist. It's a little bit like with the label post-structuralism. And I think one thing that, I mean, as early as 35, so Heidegger writes Henri Corbin saying, I do not want my being in time to be like read as an existential anthropology. But the trouble is that if you just go through the text of L'Introduction à la lecture de Hegel, there's like maybe 20, 30 occurrences of just, I've written down a few, like la phénoménologie de Hegel est donc existentielle comme celle de Heidegger et elle doit servir de base à une ontologie. Alors les deux, ils vont ensemble toujours. And there's so many instances of that, and I think we can't really separate it because with hindsight, none of them wanted to be read as existentialists, and maybe the one point where Kojève really shouldn't be read as an existentialist was, of course, his emphasis on the state. Yeah, but with all these sort of free individualism, kind of finitude, etc. But I mean, the individual means nothing without it sort of being integrated into the state. And this is where he really took leave of, like, where he really put a lot of mileage between himself and Sartre and Camus, both of whom he loathed. But I'm not sure that he completely sort of like that there's no existential element in the lectures as they're published, whether Kojève later repudiated that or not.
Shall I respond now, Isabel? Well, thank you very much, Daniel, and nice seeing you again this way. So I start with your second question, and of course, when one states a claim, it states it in a blunt way, and then you need to qualify it. What I meant was, of course, not that Kojève was not interested in the existential dimension of Heidegger's thought. This was very important for him, and in a certain sense, it provided a valuable key to the reading of the phenomenology of the spirit. But what I think that this notes on Hegel and Heidegger show is that on Kojève's account, Hegel has done a better existentialist job than Heidegger himself. That was my point. So, of course, Heidegger has this powerful existential description, but there is no question of death, of violent death, right? There is question of that. But so, in a certain, on the existentialist level, Hegel is clearly superior to Heidegger. Now, there would be, and if this were the only case, and I mean, if Heidegger would be interesting only as an existentialist, then we would not understand this famous phrase that appears in the footnote of the introduction, that Kant, Heidegger constitute the basic proponents of philosophical dualism, which is the task of the future. And this is why I thought it would be interesting to turn to Heidegger's ontology. Now, I take this opportunity also to answer the question Kyle, I think, formulated in the chat. What made Kojève think that Heidegger was an ontological dualist, right? This is also the other question. And I think this is a very intricate and sophisticated one, because if you read the text, if you don't take into account what Heidegger published after the beginning of time, you cannot see why there should be a dualist position. You would rather have the impression that he aims at a unifying position, at unifying all the meanings of being. I think that there might be some clues in this direction, but I think we don't have now time for this. And the second point, or the first point, I definitely agree with the importance of Kojève. And I think, in Hegel, in Jena, you find the exact wording, right? La phénoménologie de Hegel est une anthropologie. This is exactly what Kojève later took on. And he was, of course, accused for anthropologizing Hegel, but actually he just took a thesis from Kojève. So yeah, I think this is also an important philosophical mediator between Kojève and Heidegger also. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Fantastic. Thank you. So I haven't forgotten about you, Terry and George, but first Trevor has a question for Sophia.
Yeah, hi. So thank you, Sophia. I think that Galian mentioned this in the chat right before he left. But one thing that I find fascinating about your connection of Mamardaschvili and Kojève is that there is this connection of Althusser, a kind of unexpected connection that actually makes them have a link that I think otherwise they would appear somewhat disparate figures. Another thing, and this sort of leads me to my question that I think makes them worth a comparison, is a kind of liminal connection to Marxist traditions. I'm not asking you to say broadly what is Kojève's relationship to Marxism and what is Mamardaschvili's connection to Marxism. I realize that's a big question, but my question essentially is the following. Thinking about cogito in the way that you did with both of these figures, in which way do you see them as humanist in the sense of a Marxist humanism, or are they not humanist figures? Because I have, as someone who has a very limited understanding of Mamardaschvili, but at least some understanding of Mamardaschvili, he emerges in Soviet philosophy in a time when there's thought to be a sort of renewed interest in humanism within a sort of Marxist tradition. And I find it interesting that you are using cogito as a sort of, I think in your words, as this sort of connection to liberty in Mamardaschvili. And so I guess my question, to make a long story short, is are these humanist interpretations, are these humanist philosophers? What would you say about humanism?
What would I say about humanism? It's a great question. Thank you, Trevor. This is a great question. I think that, well, Mamardaschvili started with Marxism and Hegelianism, as I mentioned, and his dissertation was on Marxist and verwandelte Formen, actually, and it also had a link to what I said because he criticized gnosiological Repensenats there. Yeah, so it's just about his intellectual biography about Kojève. I think you all know it better than I do. His link to Hegel and his complicated relations with Marxism. About humanism, well, my point was that these two authors their intentions were purely humanistic, but they achieved this humanistic aim by different philosophical ontologies. And it's very interesting to see how they were doing it, and not to prescribe to one of them a humanistic aim and to another one a non-humanistic aim, as it is sometimes done in modern Russia today when we speak about Marxist philosophers or Hegelian philosophers, to describe them as totalitarian ones. So I would answer shortly to your question that both of them have humanistic aims, as far as I can understand now so far, but they try to achieve it basing on different philosophical ontologies. So Mamardaschvili preferred explicitly pre-Hegelian positions and Kojève Hegelian, post-Hegelian positions.
And if I could just follow up very quickly, Isa, what I find fascinating about that answer, Sophia, is that both of them therefore have as their interlocutor someone like Althusser, who seems to have an anti-humanist disposition, at least as he is traditionally understood. So it's fascinating that they therefore have him as the thread that connects the two of them.
That's true, yeah. Yeah, so their correspondence cast light to a little bit to the, I think it's cast light mostly to the situation, to the political situation, which was so hard to publish anything in Russia, in Soviet Union, and in France as well. So not as much to philosophical questions, but mostly to their human communication and political obstacles, I would say. But yeah, that's a great source anyway.
Another interesting thing is both were actually highly influential for the art of their time. Kojève and Surrealism, Mamardaschvili maybe more towards the cinema, but this could also be an interesting parallel between the two of them. Are we going to? Oh, sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I'm done. Thanks.
Okay, are we going to Terry next? Go ahead.
Hi, yeah. So my question is actually it's for Hager. I just, I mean, it might be quite a naive question, but I wonder what you make of the idea that there might be a tension between kind of Kojève's understanding of system, like as a kind of closed circle, like a complete circle, and the form that we receive Kojève's work as kind of incomplete, unfinished, unpublished manuscripts. I wonder, like, how you kind of navigate this tension in kind of emphasizing that there's a system in Kojève. You know, how would that is there? How do you deal with the kind of form and the content being so kind of different?
Thank you, Terence. I don't know if you can hear me. Can you hear me? Yeah. No, interestingly enough, the question of circularity is raised in the very first lectures. And I think that question, we should not, you know, connect it exclusively to one interpretation, because, you know, in Hegel studies, there are numerous debates around that notion, and then the scholarship moved beyond it, and then we come back to it. So, you know, but I think he was not taking to the lectures a set of problems that actually emerged from Hegel's philosophy. He was taking a set of problems that emerged from his own endeavor, his lifelong, you know, endeavor to actually create a philosophical system. And the early work, because we have to reconstruct the system. It's not a book. And I mean, if I you know, give you a very, very short answer, because I'm aware of the fact that it's late in the day and so on and so forth. I don't see tensions in the sense of the philosopher struggling to create a coherent discourse, right? He developed a mechanism to deal with contradictions. And it's too long to explain, but the real tension arises not necessarily for the systematizer, the philosopher, but it arises from the structure. And I have to choose my words very, very carefully, because he developed a conceptual terminology, and that's a very strong indicator of the presence of a system. So the structure of empirical existence, the structure of objective reality, and of, you know, the plane of ontology, he kind of like, that structure already has an embedded, you know, kind of tension within it. But I honestly don't want to use the word tension, just in the sense of the philosopher's confusion about, like, oh, he created something, because at one point in my studies, I was actually thinking, was Kojève actually, did he initially want to create a circular, closed, you know, philosophical system? He reached the end of history, and then he was surprised to find that history doesn't actually end, and he would have to account for bad infinity or other ways of, you know, he phrased that. So did he actually surprise himself? Did he end up like when you are sold a car and you're not told what's in the boot of the car, and you end up with this, like, where did this come from? Where did the boring Stoics come from? Why wouldn't they go away? And if you read the lectures very carefully, he does, towards the end, he say, I'm really not convinced about Hegel's way of, about Hegel's transitions. And look at how he poses the dilemma, Hegel-Plato, and how he poses the problem, Hegel-Kant, and these choices. And he uses the word leaps a lot. So I don't know. I think I don't know if this makes any sense to you, parents, or were you expecting, you know, I don't know, a specific answer?
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I mean, I think it also, though, maybe, I don't know what you think about this, but it maybe opens up a kind of a problematic with system itself. I mean, and the kind of, you know, the reception of philosophy that Kojève was working with had many different ideas about system. Like, you know, Hegel had a very different idea about what system is to what someone like Schelling did, or someone like Fichte. And then, you know, to see that kind of re-emerge in the Kant book, you know, Kojève's Kant book is very interesting. It's almost like we get rid of the thing in itself in order to make the system not contradict itself, to make it not have a hole in it. And I mean, but isn't it kind of odd that the reception of Kojève has all of these holes in it? I mean, we don't have, you know, we don't have this kind of corpus in the same way that we would have a corpus, say, of someone like Kant or Hegel, you know. And I
think we've just discovered recently, thanks to Jeff Love, that he's very Russian in thought and feeling. But anyway, that's another story. Actually, Jarzik and Labarrière have, in a way, much earlier than that, I think in the 90s, they kind of signed off, or, you know, Kojève's excommunication from the canon of French philosophy, that by claiming back then that, oh, he's a forger of Hegel and Hegelianism and so on and so forth. But I think we moved beyond that, and I don't know if I'm an optimist or, you know, but I think we definitely moved forward with our understanding of Kojève, and I think it's quite exciting that we come to his work from so many different disciplines. I think that's really exciting, and I want to thank the organizers of the conference, young, you know, philosophers, thinkers, academics. I don't know if you want to be called Kojèvians, but it's really, really interesting what you've done, and quite amazing. Thank you very much.
Thank you for these kind words, Hager. I think even, yeah, I think even unwittingly, we are all a bit Kojèvians just by doing what we're doing. I would love to continue this dialogue with all of you. Maybe we're all getting a drink and just continuing.
Sorry, Isabel, can I also say one thing? I would love, I mean, I have to say this, many thanks to Nina Kuznetsov for her great generosity. She is an amazing human being. She's very generous. Also, thank you to Marco for, you know, open-mindedness, because he does get some criticism every now and again. And I like the way he deals with, you know, objections to, you know, some of the things he does or writes. I would also love to thank everybody here, because I know many of you here, because I think I hardly ever encountered somebody who reads Kojève who is not generous with the material they have. I mean, Nicola Rambert is here. Everybody's so generous with, you know, the work. Marco also shared, I mean, numerous, you know, pieces of things with all of us, I believe. And Nina, basically, yeah. Thank you so much for your support, for actually being here, and for supporting the event.